Before I came to Congress, I worked in private industry, I worked in business and then in economic development. And here's what I'll tell you. We saw when you do brownfield restoration, when you clean up Puget Sound, it's actually good for business. We were able to, Tacoma is a more vibrant city because we remediated lands and waters. It's a place people want to live. It's a place where businesses want to invest and can profit. But the P in EPA doesn't stand for profit, it doesn't stand for personal gain, it stands for protection. And sadly, there are far too many examples where the environmental protections that motivated the creation of their agency have been ignored under your leadership. And a paramount example of that is climate change. I want to follow up on Ms. Pingree's line of questioning. I'd invite you to visit our region. We are seeing the impacts of climate change firsthand. You can come and see catastrophic wildfires. You can see changing ocean conditions that are impacting fishermen and shellfish growers, not just in Maine, but in Washington State. Come visit our coastal communities. I represent 11 Native American tribes, 4 are coastal tribes that, as we sit here today, are in the process of trying to move to higher ground because of persistent flooding. When the EPA doesn't act, the conditions on the ground in Washington State get worse. And the folks in my neck of the woods depend on your agency to be the first line of defense, and you've let them down. 3 months ago, to Ms. Pingree's point, you said, I think there's assumptions made that because the climate is warming, that that's necessarily a bad thing. We know that humans have most flourished during these times of warming trends. If you came to my district, I would introduce you to people who, I'd introduce you to Fawn Sharp, the president of the Quinault Indian Nation, who told me that the ocean was once a football field's length away from her village, and now it's their front porch. You could talk to the Army Corps of Engineers in our region who've responded every time their seawall breaches and their village floods. You could visit with our shellfish growers, Bill Taylor, whose business is constantly threatened by harmful algal blooms and by increasingly acidic waters that have been so bad that our government actually declared a disaster as a consequence of it. I could introduce you to a whole bunch of folks who are impacted by this. And so I'm not going to ask you to defend, industry relationships or your views on climate science that you just articulated. I guess I want your help. What do you say, to the coastal communities I represent that face an existential threat to our fisheries that are dealing with this, with ocean acidification? Do you really think they're going to flourish because of this?
Well, as I indicated earlier, I think there are a couple of questions with respect to this issue, and the one that does get lost in the discussion quite a bit is the process and the response opportunities we have as an agency. We are looking at those options on what steps we can take to regulate CO2 for stationary sources. And Congressman, that has not been done before.
So let me speak to that, because you question whether you have the legal authority to do that. Even the late Justice Scalia held that opinion that you do. In 2014, the Supreme Court decision, Justice Scalia's opinion, he wrote, the EPA sought to regulate sources that it said were responsible for 86% of all the greenhouse gas emissions emitted from stationary sources nationwide. Under the court's holdings, the EPA will be able to regulate sources responsible for 83% of those emissions.
And we are considering that as we speak. We have an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in the marketplace, soliciting comment on regulating stationary sources for greenhouse gases. That's in the marketplace today.
And I know my colleagues touched on this, but I also, in light of the challenges in these communities, what do you say to a poor tribal community that's trying to move? I visited a Head Start facility in La Push, Washington, at the Quileute tribe, that they're trying to move to higher ground because of the impacts of sea level rise, and they're struggling to find a dollar. And they're seeing this issue get worse when it's ignored in this town. How do you explain when you spend tens of thousands of dollars on travel and thousands of dollars on soundproofing? They don't have the luxury of spending thousands of dollars on soundproofing. They can't even spend thousands of dollars on waterproofing when they're getting washed out.
I think we've taken, that we actually, the no discharge zone, that's very important to you. We actually granted that no discharge zone, and I think that provided environmental benefits to your community. Superfund actions. We are taking a host of actions that I think benefit those local communities with respect to environmental protection. And this issue that we're talking about here, we are evaluating our authority to address that going forward.
I'm at my 5 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.